All right, back we come to Daniel just to review. No problem with the title. The main individual within the book, the one whose history is recorded in the first 6 chapters, and visions, 4 visions given by God to the same Daniel that are recorded in chapters 7 to 12. And we talked about the date of events from 605 BC when Daniel was about 15 years of age, all the way through the final vision that is received in 536 BC when Daniel was approximately 84 or within his mid-80s. And then if we take a date of about 530 for the book, assuming that then very closely with those final events, Daniel would be approaching 90 years of age as he puts the book into the final form that we have it within the Scripture. Within the Old Testament, within the writings, Daniel comes very providentially between Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. So as you're going through the books that were made up, the roll, the megalith, the 5 scrolls that were used in Israel's feasts. Remember from 501 we discussed Esther, and Esther brings us right to a time no mention of God. Here is Israel being protected by God as a seed of Abraham. And why is God protecting Israel as they are under this Gentile domination? Then you read Daniel. And Daniel fits into the whole scheme between 605 BC to the establishment of the kingdom. That the world is going to have a number of successive Gentile kingdoms that will be manifested until finally the final manifestation of that Gentile kingdoms is destroyed by the stone made without hands, with the one like the Son of Man to whom dominion is given. The stone without hands in Daniel 2, the Son of Man to whom dominion is given in Daniel chapter 7, who will establish God's kingdom upon the earth. And then appreciates Ezra and Nehemiah. Again, we see that Israel is under the dictates of decrees of the Persian kings. That is the way that God is manifesting his rule over Israel during this time period that began in 605 BC and will continue to the very end of this age. Now, as far as the major themes of Daniel is concerned, we'll just look at these very summarily because no matter what the interpretive stance of commentators, they recognize that, all right, this is what the book of Daniel is all about, and particularly within its Old Testament canonical connection. You cannot read the book of Daniel without recognizing that Daniel, particularly from chapter 2 all the way through chapter 11, is showing the fact that God is sovereign over the kingdoms of man. And even as he comes before Nebuchadnezzar, he states very, very definitely that God is the one who reveals mysteries. 2:28. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place at the end of the days. And it's very interesting that is the Aramaic equivalent to the Hebrew that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 49, as Moses, and as he writes down Jacob's final words on what is going to take place to the tribes of Israel in the end of the days. And we see that again in Numbers 24. We see it again in Deuteronomy chapter 4. We see it again in Deuteronomy chapter 29. And of course, as we've been looking at the prophets, even the prophets, Isaiah chapter 2. Hosea chapter 3, are writing about what is taking place until finally God will fulfill the promise that he has given to fulfill his promise to Abraham at the end of the days. Now you go back into Esther on why God will providentially watch over and protect the Jewish race, the seed of Abraham, during this period, because he has this plan and purpose, and this image that Nebuchadnezzar sees is a revelation of what will take place that will continue on until the very end of the days. And certainly in chapter 2, verse 47, Nebuchadnezzar, when Daniel has revealed the interpretation, both the dream and his interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar, says, "Surely your God is a God of gods, a Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." And then as you go through at the end of chapter 3, verses 28 to 30, once again, Nebuchadnezzar speaks of the fact of, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," etc. "No, I issue a decree, no one should speak offensively against their God." At the end of chapter 4, after Nebuchadnezzar is humiliated, in verses 34 and 35, Nebuchadnezzar pens these words, "For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, his kingdom endures from generation to generation." And so he is the one who does according to his own will. In chapter 5, there is no statement. We only see the fact that what God has said concerning Belshazzar comes to pass. In chapter 6, Darius, once again in verses 26 and 27, after what has taken place with Daniel's protection within the lion's den, again issues a decree and says, "For he is the living God, enduring forever, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So the interesting thing is, of course, as you go through the book of Daniel, Daniel first tells Nebuchadnezzar, all right, God is sovereign. There's a God in heaven who is in control of the events that take place here upon the earth, and has revealed to the king exactly what is going to take place, even until the very end of the days. And that's the purpose of the statute, to fill in basically the history from 605 BC until the very end of the days, when the kingdom of Messiah is established upon the earth. And then as we go through and see these historical narratives that are given to us, it ends up with the Gentile kings recognizing that truly Yahweh, Israel's God, the God of heaven, is truly sovereign over the kingdoms of man. And that then prepares you for the visions in chapters 7 through 11, which again point out God's sovereign control of history. He is in control of all that takes place as far as the kingdoms of man, the Gentile kingdoms that will precede the coming of God's kingdom to the earth. And God knows the end from the beginning, and he is able to speak and tell both the Gentiles and Israel exactly what is going to take place in the future. Second great theme is that Israel is a remnant now, subject to the Gentiles. In fact, Daniel chapter 1 is very, very important in this regard. Daniel and his three friends now show proper respect to the Gentile overlords. They realize that Israel's God is the one who has brought about this pattern of events, and now they have been taken to be educated, to be used within the Babylonian Empire, and they submit. Now they do appeal so that they do not have to eat the king's food that could bring impurity to them. Daniel and his three friends ask favor and compassion of the commander, saying, "Hey, give us vegetables and water for 10 days, and see if we don't look healthy," which is, why Nebuchadnezzar wants us to eat his good food, because he wants us to be healthy. Well, if we look healthy, if our flesh is good at the end of 10 days, our appearance is what Nebuchadnezzar expects, then let us eat this meager diet. And of course they pass the test and do so. And what we see in the book of Daniel is that Daniel and his three friends are obedient servants of the Gentile kings, except when they demand worship of themselves in a way which would conflict with their worship of their God. Chapter 3 and chapter 6. Other than that, we see that they are subservient to exactly what the Gentile kings are asking them. And this subservience is going to continue, chapter 9, beyond the 70 years predicted by Jeremiah. It extends beyond 70 years to 70 times 7 years. So now it's not just 70, it's 7 times 70, until finally the kingdom will be established. So that basically what Jeremiah told the exiles in Jeremiah chapter 29, which is, pray for the welfare of the nation to which God has taken you, is to continue to be a pattern for Israel during the present age. And of course that then impacts, how do you feel about some of the things that Mordecai did within the book of Esther? All right, think that through, because it is very definitely seen within Daniel 1 and again in Daniel 9 that the basic prophetic injunction that they are to be subservient to their Gentile overlords is to continue throughout this time period. We're going to come back to it, but certainly Daniel 2 and 7 show us the progression of Gentile kingdoms. Nothing caught God by surprise in the past, nor what is going to take place in the future. We will also come back to this, but as we see the progression of Gentile kings, Daniel is very, very realistic. Gentile kings are not perfect. Far from it. In fact, their besetting sin is pride. They really think that they, through their own power, their own wisdom, their own ingenuity, have brought themselves in the position of domination that they have. It is very, very interesting. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a statue. He is the head of gold. He's not just satisfied with being the head of gold. What does he do in chapter 3? He makes a statue and has the whole thing gold-plated. It's all of gold. In other words, when you see it from top to bottom, from head to toe, it is gold. In other words, he's not just satisfied with the representation that God has given to him. He has to have a whole statue that people bow down and worship him. And see, that's the result of pride. Because of pride on the part of these Gentile rulers, they want their subjects to pander to that pride by giving them worship. In fact, worship that ultimately belongs to God and God alone. And be very, very, very careful because certainly the greatest challenge that not only do worldlings, that is, Gentile rulers have, but guess what? The great first sin of him who is behind the Gentile rulers and seeking to have their kingdom established vis-a-vis in place of the kingdom of God. Satan, his great sin was pride. And what is the greatest sin, the greatest temptation to sin of even those who take leadership within the Church of Jesus Christ? It is always there, the pride. And we see it again in chapter 4 where Nebuchadnezzar is humbled by God because of his pride. When he looks at Babylon and says, wow, look what I have built. And God says, you've just gone too far. And so he was humble for 7 years like an animal. And very interestingly, by Daniel chapter 7, the Gentile rulers are going to be viewed not as a great statue. And remember, that's Nebuchadnezzar's dream. When a vision is given to Daniel, those same rulers, those same empires, kingdoms are no longer look like a wonderful, beautiful statue. They now come across as ferocious animals. All right, the movement in those chapters is very, very profound. And of course, that is all preparing us in chapter 7 and 8 for what we might call the battle of little horns. There's a little horn of Daniel 7, a little horn of Daniel 8. And the interesting thing is what motivates both of those little horns, and we'll say exactly who they are, is pride. And how they want to be God and want to have worship as God. And so obviously the Lord is going to have to humble them. And again, the characteristic of a final ruler, which is debated, we'll take a look at in interpretive issues, but again, a king who is lifted up with pride. So it's an ongoing problem, but Daniel particularly points prophetically to two individuals in the future who will have a special problem with pride. And that special problem with pride is going to lead to a great amount of persecution as far as the saints, Israelites in the future, are concerned. And yet, we cannot lose the fact that in Daniel, there will be, at the end of this time period of Gentile domination within human history, there will be the ultimate establishment of God's kingdom. And so the purpose of Daniel is very simply to show the sweep of human history during Gentile domination until the establishment of God's kingdom upon the earth. And when is God's kingdom going to be established? Well, Daniel 12:12 says, "Blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to 1,335 days." It is good to be alive on the 1,335th day. Well, after what? Well, we'll talk about that interpretively, but that's where you want to be, gentlemen. You want to be on the 1,335th day, because that's when God's kingdom will be established upon the earth. But as for you, go your way to the end, and then you will enter into rest and rise for your allotted portion at the end of the days. It's interesting how Daniel ends. It ends at the end of the days, when finally God's plan and purpose for Israel and the nations is completed, when his kingdom is established upon the earth. And even though Daniel will die, he'll be raised again to take part in that coming kingdom. Now, as far as the literary development of the book is concerned, you could almost make this, an interpretive issue, because there has been and continues to be discussion on what's the structure of Daniel really is, the overarching structure of the book. I didn't chart this out for you, but the classic approach is to divide Daniel into two major divisions. The first 6 chapters are the history of Daniel, and the last 6 chapters are the visions of Daniel. So historically, and the majority of commentators to this day still divide Daniel into 2 separate equal halves. All right, the history, and as with Old Testament narrative, you should be familiar with this at this point, even though Daniel is the writer, Daniel is always mentioned in what person? Third person. That goes all the way back to Moses. Moses, remember in the Torah, as he narrates, he always speaks about himself in the third person. You know, Moses said this, and Moses did that, even though Moses is the one that we know from the Scripture wrote it. And so the same thing is seen in Daniel. It is just a normal aspect of Hebrew narrative where a person speaks about himself in the third person. By the way, that's not like the first person plural we have today. Well, we see it this way. Well, I think after much study, we would say this. Yeah, it'd be more this way, that if I was speaking like a Hebrew narrator, I would say, now, as we come to this portion after much thought, Professor Essex sees it this way. All right, well, that's, if I was writing narrative, Hebrew narrative, that's how I should say it. That's the way Daniel does. But once we get to the visions, what takes place? Now it's not Daniel he, but Daniel, I saw this. This vision was given to me. I saw in visions at night. So when you get to those last 4 visions that make up the last 6 chapters of the book, now Daniel, as he recounts the visions, will speak in the first person. So that's the classic approach. A second approach is given to you in Walton's book, and you should be familiar with this, the parallel structure of the book of Daniel, where he has charted for you an article that came out in 1981 by David Gooding on the literary structure of the book of Daniel, and then its implications for the purpose and the understanding, the interpretation of the book as a whole. And he saw chapters 1 to 5 as a unit, and then chapters 6 through 12 as a unit. And I will just kind of now zoom in right here so we can look at the first 5 chapters, the sacred vessels that are brought to Babylon, with Daniel refusing to indulge in pagan impurities, that is, through his eating, leads to 2 images with the dream and then the making of the image in chapter 3, and then 2 kings discipline, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, with the desecration of sacred vessels that takes place in chapter 5. Then, in chapter 6, he says, okay, it begins all over again, where we see Daniel refusing to cease praying. All right, because of a decree that has been issued. All right, just as chapter 1 began with the vessels being brought, and chapter 5 ends up with their desecration. Chapter 6, we have this decree that will end up with finally God's unchangeable decree of the establishment of his kingdom. That leads in chapters 7 and 8 where, and everyone agrees with this, we have two visions that are given to Daniel that are very much related. Because, again, we have in the end a beast that has a little horn, as seen in both chapter 7 and chapter 8. And then we have two further visions that explains the writings of Jeremiah and then fills in the data of the prophets in chapters 10 to 12, which ends up with the King of Kings that God has brought, exalting himself above all the gods. So his structure is, all right, here's 1 through 5, here's 6 through 12, and as you go through, and Walton has given you that chart. Gooding's proposal is not really caught on. Obviously, Gooding believes it, and obviously Walton gives some credence to it. But among most commentators, this has been viewed as, okay, having some very interesting correspondence between, obviously, chapters 2 and 3, chapters 4 and 5, chapters 7 and 8, chapters 9 and 10 through 12, seeing some of those correlations, but is that the overarching theme of the book? I would go along with a significant minority of commentators now. The first place I read this was in Robert Culver's Daniel and the Latter Days. And that is a book that a number of contemporary commentators now make reference to as within the text, seeing a very subtle change based upon the language that is used. Beginning in chapter 2, verse 4, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. All right, there's your narrative statement in Hebrew, and then Aramaic is used. And is used all the way through the end of chapter 7. Now, it's very, very interesting because we find out that as you read the book, that obviously Daniel has been trained in the wisdom and language of the Babylonians. So now he speaks, as it were, the Gentile language. He's been trained to be a servant of the Gentiles. He speaks to the Gentiles. And there's a sense from 2:4 through the end of chapter 7 that this part of Daniel is a part of Daniel accessible to Gentiles. If Daniel is being read, all right, they hear all the way through chapter 2, 4a, and it doesn't make any sense to them because they don't know Hebrew. But as soon as they start hearing Aramaic, they can understand that. Now, obviously, as Israel first went into exile, this would, not be available to them. By the time Daniel writes, in about 535 to 530 BC, most of the Israelites themselves in exile, being second generation, would have learned the Aramaic. It communicates to them as well. But it also communicates to the Gentiles. Then when they get to the Hebrew, then they can understand what is being said. And it's kind of like this. In chapters 2, particularly beginning in verse 4, that's why the parentheses there, but it all begins with Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the events that are narrated in the first 3 verses leading into the speaking in Aramaic that then, as we said, continues on through chapter 7. All right, it is Israel that listens in to what God has communicated to and for the Gentiles. Then after hearing that and having that framework, then in chapters 8 to 12, further revelation is given particularly to them. Right? In the Hebrew, what do we see in the first chapter? The godly remnant of Israel. Now, it's very, very significant. As you go back to the book of Genesis, Where do the nations come from? They come from the sons of Noah. And what happened with the sons of Noah? Well, they gathered together in the plains of Shinar to build a tower to God, to the heavens, not to God, but to make for themselves a name. Pride, hubris, dethroning of God, taking God's place. But we continue to see within the book of Daniel. And they come together in the plains of Shinar. And to defeat their plan at that point, God comes down and does what? Confounds their language. Now it is very interesting in chapter 1 of Daniel, verse 2. And by the way, that should be 1-2 for Shinar. He brought them in the land of Shinar. Daniel is using the very terminology of Genesis chapter 11. Right? Now, as the nations went off in rebellion against God, God's answer was the Abrahamic covenants. Remember the Torah. And we've already seen leading into Daniel, God is going to continue to work to protect the physical seed of Abraham. That's his promise that will ultimately turn things around for both, obviously, the nation that comes from Abraham and the Gentiles to receive blessing from God at the end of the days when the kingdom is established. But they come to Shinar, and in verse 4, that he ordered them to teach to these royal families and nobles the literature and language, tongue of the Chaldeans. And so what we need to realize is now, because of their sin, the physical seed of Abraham finds themselves in Shinar in the midst of the Gentiles learning their language. And why is their language distinct? Because of Genesis chapter 11. So really, Daniel prepares us for the fact this is how God is going to work through his promise to Abraham to deal with the rebellion of the Gentiles and placing this godly remnant of Israel now among the Gentiles, where they will remain until the kingdom is established. Then in chapter 2 through 7, we have the prophetic course of the Gentile dominion from 605 BC, the establishment of the kingdom. Here's what's going to take place. Chapter 8 through 12. Now, within that history, here's particularly what's going to happen to Israel during that time, leading up to the establishment of the kingdom. To further define that second movement, the prophetic course of Gentile dominion, we have, as we've already said, as we go through the book of Daniel, we have a very, very definite order. But you can follow right along here and see it. All right, you've got a dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, a dream of Daniel in chapter 7. Notice, both deal with 5 kingdoms. 4 Gentile kingdoms, and then the ultimate kingdom that will be established from heaven. With the dream of a statue, with the dream of, including among the animals, a lion. Then significantly, in chapter 3, we've already talked about, you have the making of a statue. In Daniel 6, Daniel's thrown in the lion's den, and then has the dream, the visions recorded of the animals, including a lion. Going along with what, not quite what Gooding said, but notice in chapter 3 you have the official's accusation against the 3 friends of Daniel, the official's accusation against Daniel. So there is a connection between the events in chapter 3 and chapter 6. And we have, and Gooding himself brought this up, the humbling first of Nebuchadnezzar and then the humbling of Belshazzar. Interestingly, in verses 23-32, Nebuchadnezzar will be with the beast, and in chapter 5, verse 21, Belshazzar and those with him will act like beasts. Nebuchadnezzar will respond and be restored. Belshazzar will have a weak response, but he will lose the kingdom. Of course, he will honor Daniel, but Daniel's interpretation will certainly come to pass. And we've already seen that we have a movement from statue to beasts, with the lions, and then ultimately the vision of the beasts in chapter 7. Then when we get to the prophetic course of Israel's history, all right, what's going to take place to Israel during this time of Gentile domination? 3 visions are given. In chapter 8, we find out Israel during the Persian and Greek kingdoms. We have an overview of their history from the time of Persia, which will defeat the Babylonians, up through this little horn who will come from this third kingdom, that is the Greek, the Hellenistic kingdoms that will be established. Then in chapter 9, all right, now chapter 8 takes us through this monster who's going to come in the third kingdom, the Greek kingdom. Then chapter 9, in the chronology, talks about the prince who is going to come. And so in Daniel 9:26, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, beginning in chapter 10, we're going to have a third vision, which is going to fill in more of the details of what is seen in chapter 8. And then in chapter 11, jump from the little horn to the coming prince. It's going to jump, and I'll interpret it at this point, from Antiochus Epiphanes to the Antichrist. It's going to jump from Greece to Rome. And the renewed expression of the Roman Empire, the fourth kingdom, that will be headed by this coming prince, who is going to be destroyed by the ultimate king, who is going to come, the exalting king, who we know back from chapter 2 as the stone made without hand, chapter 7, the one like the Son of Man, one like a Son of Man. And so, all right, Israel, you're going to go through, and here's Daniel saying, okay, during this time of the Gentiles leading up to the establishment of the kingdom, you're going to have a particular difficulty with this little horn. You're going to have a particular difficulty with a coming prince. A prince who's going to make a firm covenant with you for a week, and in the middle of it, break it, bring in abomination, until finally all this decreed upon him comes to pass, And then he blends the two together in chapters 10 and 11 so that the little horn prefigures the coming prince who will be destroyed by the Son of Man when he comes to establish his kingdom. All right, so here is the flow, I believe, of the book of Daniel. I would use a three-part division. The godly remnant among the Gentiles, and during the time when the remnant is among the Gentiles, the flow of Gentile kingdoms, chapters 2 through 7, with chapters 3 through 6 giving Israel an opportunity to understand something of the pride and the demand for worship that will come from those Gentile kings. And yet God is going to sovereignly overrule and ultimately bring his kingdom. But before that takes place, chapters 8 through 12, here's particular revelation for you, Israel, of some difficult times that you will go through, particularly the time of Antiochus Epiphanes of about 3.5 years, and then prefiguring a 3.5-year period that will come in the future under the coming prince, where in both times you will be severely persecuted until finally the Lord will come and establish his kingdom upon the earth. So here is the flow of those Gentile empires. Just a few things about some bibliographic resources available. 2 exegetical commentaries done by English commentators from a very broadly evangelical perspective. I would continue to get the work by John Goldingay. The word by Ernest Lucas is very much, at most points, just an echo of what is in Goldingay. Yeah, he brings up the bibliographies and the discussion a little more up to date. But of the two, I would get Goldingay. Now, he interacts much with both contemporary conservative and liberal exegetes. Gives you a lot of lexical, syntactical, textual data. Interacts with the structure of Daniel. Watch out for his conclusions, but nevertheless, as far as his at least foundational exegetical work, it is the place to begin. 2 good volumes on English interpretation. Walvoord and Wood, Leon Wood, John Walvoord, both now with the Lord. Actually, I enjoy Wood a little more than Walvoord, but Walvoord is the kind of standard pre-mill dispensational commentary. So we'll point to that. Expositionally, there really just is not a good work available on Daniel. You might want to get some of the little booklets from the Book Shack. Daniel is one of the 2 books of the Old Testament that Dr. MacArthur has preached. And though there is not a volume itself available on Daniel, there are portions of Daniel that are available in his little paperback series. So pick those up as you can, and use those to guide your own personal preaching in Daniel. All right, very quickly, and I'll deal with the first 2 very, very quickly. Certainly, the overarching interpretive issue of Daniel is the dating of the book. Now, as you can see, and those of us who believe in biblical inerrancy, even though this is a part of the writings and not part of the prophets, yet nevertheless in Matthew 24:15, Christ referred to Daniel as a prophet. That is, even though, like Joseph, he was in his in his vocation, was a servant of a Gentile king. Nevertheless, through the visions given to him, dreams and visions given to him with the interpretation thereof, in the last 6 chapters, these are certainly prophetic. They talk about the future. But then so does the interpretation of the dreams of chapters 2 and 7. And as we said, even though chapters 3 through 6 deal with historical events, those historical events are prophetic of what kind of rulers the Gentiles will be. That Israel and even we as Gentiles can certainly have an insight into that. As I said, even evangelicals today like Golden Gate and Lucas see the final composition of the book sometime during the Maccabean period, around 165 to 150 BC. That which really sticks in the craw of liberals is Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11 is so precise on the establishment of Alexander's kingdom after the defeat of the Persians and its division with a southern power, the Ptolemies, centered in Egypt, and the northern power, the Seleucids, that were centered in Antioch, Syria. And the events that are recorded are so precise to history through chapter 11, verse 35. So beginning as he starts to bring up what is going to take place, beginning in chapter 11, verse 2 all the way through 11:35. And of course, liberals say, because this would give validity to literal prophecy. If Daniel actually had given this, that it can't be so. And Golden Gate and Lucas buy into those ideas, although both being evangelical want to say that in the end, the book of Daniel as we have it is a composite of pre-existing documents, some of which might go back almost to Daniel's day. So I didn't bring Golden Gate, but you can see his extensive chart. It's amazing how he's able to figure out exactly where every part of Daniel came from and how the final author was able to bring it together into the book as we have it within the canon today. And of course, you got to know that chart because he's going to interpret everything against exactly when everything developed as far as what is in a given chapter. Well, based upon the New Testament, is very interesting. Jesus Christ himself said, now when you see what was said by Daniel the prophets, his words are that which was spoken through Daniel the prophet. Let the reader understand. Let the reader of Daniel understand what Daniel has spoken. All right, I'll take Jesus Christ over any liberal commentator. All right, you understand what Daniel has spoken. Now, of course, Golden Gate and Lucas' answer to that is, as long as Daniel spoke it and later on was written down and later on brought into the book as we have it, inspiration, because they don't know what inerrant is, but inspiration stands. Well, I would say the best way inspiration stands and inerrancy stands is when Christ says, Daniel spoke it, let the reader understand, then it goes back to Daniel. And as within the book of Daniel, I assume implicitly that all of Daniel comes from Daniel. It's what Daniel wrote. It's what Daniel has been used of God to say, to write down. So I would see it as somewhere around 590 BC. And again, I put 10:1 because that's the last dated vision that, as we've already seen, comes from 535 BC. Very quickly, some lay people trip over the dating. They read in Daniel 1:1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar king came to Jerusalem and besieged it. When you take a look at Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 1, it talks about this being in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. All right, from 501, remember, accession and non-accession years. Under accession year dating, 3rd year, non-accession dating, 4th year. Did Babylon use the accession year dating? Yes, they did. We can see this from that little chart I gave you concerning Daniel chapter 2, verse 1, in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. But if you go back to 1:5, they should be educated 3 years. How could they be educated 3 years and yet this taking place in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar? Well, very, very simple. All right, 3 years means the part of any 3 years. And the 3rd year on the accession year reckoning would be the 2nd year. Year 1, accession year. Year 2, year 1. Year 3, year 2. So they were trained for 3 years, and at the end of that training, they come into the service of Nebuchadnezzar. In the service of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel in Daniel chapter 2. In his 2nd year, by accession year reckoning, this is the year when this dream is dreamed by Nebuchadnezzar and given and interpreted by Daniel. So there's the accession year reckoning, which brings together the chronology of Daniel 1 versus Daniel 2, and then that helps us appreciate Daniel 1 vis-a-vis Jeremiah chapter 25. All right, then we move on, and in reading Golding Gay, I've had to adjust a little bit what is interpretive issue number 3. What are the kingdoms of Daniel 2? And I guess I should put Daniel 2 and 7. Well, we have no problem with the fact that the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. Because when Daniel speaks to him, when he speaks about the head of gold and gives the interpretation, he says in 238, "You are the head of gold." Now some take the whole statue to be Babylon. Here's Nebuchadnezzar, and then we have 3 future rulers of Babylon, the last of which Nabonidus divides. He has his co-regent Belshazzar, and so under his final rule, the Babylonian kingdom is divided, and then the stone without hands becomes Cyrus, who comes and destroys the Babylonian kingdom. As you can see, none of the interpreters I've given to you commentaries take that position. Golding Gay says, well, it's very, very clear. The head, the first kingdom, is Babylon. After that, it's unspecific. Yeah, nothing else is specified because Daniel doesn't tell us. You, O king, are the head of gold, and after you, there will arise another kingdom. And then another, and then another. All right, but notice he doesn't give any kind of interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar, on what those kingdoms are. So Golding Gay says, nor should we. Lucas, with a question mark, says, well, obviously the last kingdom, when you get to chapter 7 and 8, because he sees a little horn like Golding Gay as being the same in both chapters, since the little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, very definitely in chapter 8, that means the little horn of Daniel 7, which is the 4th kingdom, is Greece. So therefore, if Babylon is first and Greece is 4th, we have Media and then Persia. But those who argue against that would point to chapter 8, verse 20, where the ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Media and Persia are never divided in the book of Daniel. They are viewed as one kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom. And so the best way to understand the kingdoms is this: Babylon, defeated by the Medes and Persians. So you have the Medo-Persian kingdom established. with Cyrus the Mede, who has become the king of the Persian Empire. And then that kingdom defeated by Greece, very clear in Daniel chapter 8. I'll lead you to take a look at the MacArthur study notes on that. And beyond Daniel, knowing historically that the Hellenistic kingdoms of Greece were ultimately defeated by Rome. And so Rome is the final kingdom. And the way this looks, and I've given you this chart, therefore, that helps you to appreciate Daniel 2 and 7. The head of gold, or the lion, in chapter 7 is Babylon. The breast of arms in silver, or the bear, in chapter 7 is Medo-Persia. The belly and thighs of bronze, the leopard, in chapter 7 is Greece. The legs of iron and the beast with dreadful iron teeth. Notice the nondescript beast in chapter 7 is Rome. And we see that this kingdom is the kingdom which overcomes the previous kingdom, Greece, but is the kingdom ultimately that is destroyed to make way for the kingdom that comes from heaven. And so it's interesting that you have the legs of iron, and then ultimately when you get to the bottom, you find feet of iron and clay. And this dreadful beast that has 10 horns in chapter 7, with then a little horde arising and taking 3 and having the other 7 coming under submission to him. And all of this is tied into what's going to take place at the very end of the days. So I use the classic term among premillennialists that this is revived Rome. That somehow, from what happened historically as far as the Roman Empire, and of course the question is, did Rome ultimately collapse? And the answer in one sense is, well, yes, but in another sense, no. Roman language, Roman law, Roman culture has continued to be seen, particularly obviously within the previous landmass of Rome, that ultimately will coalesce and come together sometime within the future, very possibly under this final little horn who will come in the future. But as far as the kingdoms that are given in Daniel 2 and 7, it's best to see it as not splitting Media and Persia apart, but seeing this as these 4 kingdoms, with the final kingdom in some way recoalescing in the future toward the very end of the days. I just put number 4 down for you to know that there is a great debate among commentators on how we are to understand the words of Nebuchadnezzar and all that is said about his humbling by God. It's very, very true that all of Daniel chapter 4 is Daniel quoting Nebuchadnezzar. This is Nebuchadnezzar's words. All the way to verse 37 of chapter 4. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways just, and he's able to humble those who walk in pride. And the great debate comes, is this a statement of, all right, I praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, that now he has become a single worshiper of the King of heaven, Yahweh, Daniel's God? Is this a statement of his conversion? Notice Wood is the most dogmatic commentator He goes where others will only say it seems more probable that this is the position to be taken. Because the classic approach, Calvin, Hengstenberg, Loophole, others, has been that in the end, Nebuchadnezzar has done no more than affirm what he affirms at the end of chapter 3 and what Darius will affirm at the end of chapter 6. This is not a clear statement of the fact that Yahweh now is the sole one whom Nebuchadnezzar worships. It's just a statement of his recognition of the greatness and authority of Yahweh, and the fact that, okay, Yahweh, this God of heaven, Daniel's God, is greater than any other gods. He rules over heaven in the way no other God does. But that is short of, all right, I have now come to embrace He and He alone. I repent, I turn my back upon all other so-called gods and honor and worship Him alone. Can I say this, gentlemen, before you preach it, make sure you know where you stand and why, because people are going to be waiting to hear. Was he or was he not? Now, my answer is, if Nebuchadnezzar's in the kingdom, position A. If he's not there, position B. I lean toward position B. I don't think there's enough final evidence to say that we can say Nebuchadnezzar was recorded. I'm just doing what I just complained about, all the question marks in position A. I think it's more probable with a question mark for B. So I'm like Walford and Archer and expositors and Pentecost and Bible knowledge commentary. My feet are firmly planted in midair. All right, 5, and I've had to add a few things here too. I just gave you, based upon the MacArthur Study Bible note, the lengthy discussion. In fact, you're reading this through and you see in verse 531, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Conservatives and liberals alike state this is the most important historical statement within the book, and really where you land on the interpretation of this verse usually goes on whether you see Daniel as reflecting history or Daniel as basically being fiction. Well, you can, and why I've added E is obviously, unfortunately, even none of our commentators end up with E as a non-historical person. But who is he? Darius the Mede. Okay, Cyrus was a Mede who became king of the Persians and then brought the Medians under his control before Babylon was conquered. There is, because of the Cyrus cylinder, an indication that a general, Ugbaru, was the one who literally took Babylon, and a number of days later Cyrus came himself. Ugbaru then dies just a few days after Cyrus comes to Babylon, and Cyrus, for about 3 years, while he continued on his conquests of the remainder of the Babylonian kingdom militarily, had to get Nabonidus and basically destroy the final resistance, established one Gubbaru as governor or his under king as far as the city of Babylon in southern Mesopotamia was concerned. And then he also had a son, Cambrys, who in 522, when he died, followed on for Cyrus. And I just got it wrong, in 530. He ruled from 530 to 522. Cambrys, his son, and there are some who hold that this Darius is Cyrus's son, who was a co-regent at this point, although that is not clear from Persian records. I would lean, along with the study Bible, on the basis of chapter 6, verse 28, that Darius is another name for Cyrus. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, that is, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So that he was known as far as his median background as Darius, and there's a real possibility Darius was a throne name. It goes back to the Medes. Interestingly, when Cambrys is removed from the kingship forcefully in 522 BC, is replaced by Darius I, a governor within his cabinet. Why does he take the name Darius? Because that seems to have had, throne connotations to it. Kings are named Darius. So that Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the Great, can also be Darius the Mede. He was approximately 62 years of age when Babylon was taken. As you can see, Wood, based upon Whitcomb, and Archer, based upon Whitcomb, make a strong case for C. Donald Wiseman is the one who has written most extensively in support of position A. But all the commentaries will get into it. But understand and start, if Darius the Mede can be proved to be fiction, then the liberals have won their case. That's why this has come within about the last 125 years as being the most debated historical point within the book. Because everything else is basically, that seems to follow along what we think from records. Well, this could fit into records, but here's a particular statement, a particular individual. Who is he? Because Darius the Mede doesn't show up in any extra biblical documents with that name. So that's why this great argument at this point. Now, we've already talked about the little horn in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Let's begin with what is clear, Daniel 8. Because Daniel makes it clear, 8:21. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the little horn that's between his eyes is the first king. And the broken and the four horns that arose in his place represent four kingdoms that will arise from his nation. So it's very, very clear. The goat is Greece. All right? The horn, this is first horn, large horn, is Alexander the Great. And upon his death, within a generation, the kingdom is divided into four. So now you got four horns that arose. And in the latter period of their kingdom, when transgressions have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue, etc., going back to the vision. This is the little horn that arises out of this goat. Verse 8, the male goat magnified himself, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, his place four conspicuous horns, and out of one of them came a fourth small horn, little horn, that grew up. Now, as we take a look at history, we realize Daniel said this is Greece. And this is a little horn that arises in one of the kingdoms which comes out of Alexander the Great's kingdom. Liberal and conservative alike have no problem on who the little horn of Daniel 8 is. It's Antiochus Epiphanes. In 168, 167 BC, comes in, abominates the temple, the holy place. And so for 2,300 evenings and mornings, there's approximately 1,150 days, the sacrifices are not offered until finally he is broken, the temple is purified. and the worship is reestablished. And during that time, tremendous opposition against the saints. So tremendous that it was the backdrop for the Maccabean revolt. So no problem in Daniel 8, but what about Daniel 7? Well, if our understanding is right, the fourth beast is not Greece. The fourth beast is Rome. And so chapter 7, here's the fourth beast. And it was different from all the other beasts, and at the end of that verse, had 10 horns. And while I was contemplating the horns, another horn, a little one, came up, and 3 of the ones were pulled out, and he continued to speak abominations until he is replaced, verses 13 and 14, with the one like the Son of Man, who will establish God's kingdom. All right, so who is this one? Well, from the fourth beast, we assume that he is the man of sin, who is prefigured by Antiochus Epiphanes. There is a correlation between them. What Antiochus Epiphanes did in 168, 167 to 165, 164 BC to Israel, to the remnant of Israel back in the land under the third kingdom, is what this little horn of the fourth kingdom will do. Well, will do when we get to Daniel chapter 9 in the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. And so that leads into, what about the 77s? Okay, Daniel realizes that the 70 years of Jeremiah were about to come to an end in the first year of Darius, 538 BC. He's realizing, it's not going to be very, very quickly. The decree is going to be issued. The remnant is going to return. And the beginning of the temple, as far as its rebuilding, will take place. The 70 years of Daniel are coming to an end. And so Daniel does what any man of Torah would do. Confesses Israel's sin as foundation to God's forgiveness, so that the kingdom might be established. But Gabriel comes and says, the end of the 70 years is not when Israel's sin is going to be finally and completely forgiven. That awaits another 70 times 7. And those 77s of Daniel 9, 24 to 27, within this context, are best understood as 70 sevens of years, or 490 years. Now, Golden Gay and Lucas just say, well, that's symbolic. That's just for a period of time. A period of time from when God is going to allow the city to be rebuilt until finally, atonement, will be brought and the kingdom established. So it's just symbolic. For those who take it literally, and it's very interesting, some liberals take it literally. But what Daniel really wanted to say here was it's 490 years from Daniel to Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the prince who ultimately is going to bring the abomination in 3 years. 3.5 years, he's going to be destroyed. Of course, the only problem is there's a little less than 490 years from when this is given in 538 BC to those events that take place in 167. So it's a little over 400 years, not 490 years. It falls a little short. Well, what's a few years among friends? That's the liberals' approach. But the writer expected this to be taken literally. This is a literal time period from Daniel to Antiochus Epiphanes. And maybe he was thinking about sometime after Nebuchadnezzar's death, to Antiochus Epiphanes as being those 490 years. Two interpretations as far as premills, as you can see. From Ezra to the Messiah. So the decree that is spoken of here is the decree of Ezra chapter 7 that allows Ezra to go back. And that 483 years, because the last week is still to come, would lead us to the beginning of Jesus' ministry. What they would put in 26, 27 AD. Now, some, even E.J. Young and other covenantalists, would see this, and they would then cut it off. Say, well, Christ ministered for 3.5 years, and after 3.5 years he was cut off. And then after he was the cutting off of the Messiah, then there is the destruction of the temple, and symbolically, spiritually, the kingdom has been established. So they would cut it off. I think it's had it's just from Ezra to Messiah. And with Messiah's death and then the destruction of the temple, the 70 weeks have come to an end. Now, Wood and Archer take that position, but say that's just 483 years. The 483 years end with the beginning of Christ's ministry. And sometime after that, all right, he dies. And then the prince who's going to come, who destroys the temple in 70 AD, is obviously then preparing the way for the tribulation period and this Roman ruler. Walverde and Pentecost take the classic position that this decree is Nehemiah, the one that was given to him in Nehemiah 2, 444 BC. So that the 483 years end, following Sir Robert Anderson, with Christ coming into Jerusalem. If you had known this day, this very day, Christ's triumphal entry, Luke chapter 19. And then after that, Messiah is cut off, has nothing. And then after the final 7 years, and Wood and Archer take that position and the last 7 years go all the way through to the end of the tribulation. And the one who makes abomination is the Antichrist. Which then leads us into Daniel chapter 11. That, and everyone agrees, liberal and conservatives all the way through 1135, that this is what is either prophetically conservative or historically liberal, reflected what has taken place in the Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly of the north, the Seleucids, the south, Ptolemies. And verse 35 has brought us all the way down to Antiochus Epiphanes. And some of those who will have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time. Because it's still to come at the appointed time. That with that term, okay, they now have insight into the end time and what's appointed in the future. Then picks up in verse 36, and yes, it is just a vav consecutive, and the king will do as he pleases. Now, Golden Gate and Lucas said there's absolutely no grammatical, contextual reason to say this is anything other than Antiochus Epiphanes. Yeah, a type of all those belligerent, proud Gentile kings who will come in the future, who might see the final manifestation in the man of sin, man of lawlessness when you get to the New Testament. But here's Antiochus Epiphanes. That's all Daniel had in mind. Whereas you can see, the premills will say, no, there's a jump at this point contextually on the basis of verse 35. Now verses 36 to 39 talk about what this future king will do, like unto what Antiochus Epiphanes did historically. That very definitely leads in verse 40, at the end time the king of the south will collide with him. With who? And the king of the north will storm against him. Who? Well, if the king of the north is Antiochus, how does the king of the north storm against the king of the north? So even though the classic positions, you just got two here, just continuing on with Antiochus and Ptolemy, how does Antiochus attack Antiochus? And so the best position, I think, is position A. Seeing in verse 36 to 39, you now have this final king, who Antiochus Epiphanes, yes, prefigured, but the Antichrist, the man of sin. Now we see at the end times, you've got him having to deal, as he comes into the promised land, with a king of the south and a king of the north, which are historically distinct from what had taken place with the Grecian kingdom. Rather than with Archer, that we've still got Antichrist being the north, because again, how does Antichrist attack Antichrist, who he himself is seen as in verses 36 to 39 as being Antichrist? So I think the three-king approach, we three kings of Daniel 11R, at this point is the better way to understand it.
Does it take both of those?
It takes both. 11:36 to 45 is dealing first and foremost with Antichrist, and yet Antichrist is viewed in verses 40 and following as the king of the north. But the problem is, how the king of the north attack the king of the north, if you're going to take that position. Well, Archer's got his reasons. You can read them within the text. But
under 9?
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry about that. This should be BKC. This is Bible Knowledge Commentary. I'm sorry. Scratch that. That's BKC. I thought you meant going back here. Yeah, he's almost at war with himself because. And then finally, what about these 1290, 1335 days? Where they begin? Well, I believe they begin going back to Daniel chapter 9, the last 3.5 years, which with years of 360 days comes to 1260 days. 1260th day is when Messiah returns. 1211 to 1290 days. All right, tells us very definitely that's when the regular sacrifice is now reestablished, so 30 days to deal with Christ's enemies, and the sacrifices are reestablished. And then we have the judgments taking place, judgments of living Israel, judgment of the Gentiles, who will go into the kingdom. Blessed is the one at the 1335th day, and during that time too will also be the resurrection of Old Testament saints. So I would say it's not symbolic, but it's literal, and it's not dealing with the cleaning up after Antiochus Epiphanes, but the period between the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the millennium. By the way, the millennium is 1,000 years. I mean, that's chronology as well. Preaching Daniel. Well, Daniel has a lot. There's two elements to Daniel, obviously, the faithfulness of his life, teaching the Israelites how to live during the time of the Gentiles, which gives great encouragement how we should live during the time of the Gentiles. Then obviously his prophetic portion is very, very important to lay a foundation for the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, 25, and the book of Revelation. So study it through and sometime preach through it as God allows you to do so.